One of the commenters in my thread about recommendations for videos mentioned Billy Graham. And he's, of course, in the news because he passed away at the age of 99. And so I've been doing some reflecting on him today. One of the things that it's hard for people to realize is what a monumental figure Billy Graham was in the United States and the world in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s. At that point, his influence began to wane. This man was on a first name basis with every president from, I don't know about Truman, but Eisenhower to George W. Bush. I mean, I hear some Peterson fans talking about could Jordan Peterson save Western civilization? Jordan Peterson isn't close to the influence that Billy Graham had. And it's important to recognize that it wasn't just Billy Graham. In this article in Christianity Today, which is taken from an upcoming book, it talks about the fact that the title of the article is Lead Us Not into Scandal. And one of the things that Graham recognized was that there were some very predictable things taking out evangelists, and today perhaps we know them best via Jimmy Swaggart or Jimmy and Tammy Bakker. They were very money, sex, and power. And so one of the things that Billy Graham did was establish an institution. Now at the Jordan Peterson event this past Saturday, someone tweeted and said, "Are you going to ask a question?" Well, I didn't buy a VIP ticket, and I wasn't planning on doing a question anyway. But my question, for one of the questions that endures for Peterson is, okay, you're on a status rocket. What are you going to do with respect to institutions? Because institutions not only amplify influence, they also help individuals keep from misstepping. In the comments section over a lot of my videos, there are a lot of people who express their disappointment in church and how churches have stumbled. Part of the reason we need church is because even though organizations stumble, they're all made of human beings, and they all have problems, and organizations can tend to amplify human weaknesses as well as human strengths. But organizations help people get things right via accountability. And so one of the things that Billy Graham did was he established an organization. So all of this money flowing in wouldn't go to him. He drew a settled salary determined by a board of directors who managed the money, and they practiced transparency with respect to all of the money coming in. That's a key thing in Christian ministry, because what we see happening in politics, where donors or special interest can in a sense magnify themselves via politicians, via money. And one of the things that we want to see in church is to kind of take that out. Now, you can never eliminate it. Every pastor knows who the big givers of his congregation are. But it's really important that if some of those big givers want to try to use their money as influence, that pastors learn to say no and really resist that. And pastors are helped to do that if in fact they are behind an organization and they are beneath an organization. And so one of the things that Billy Graham did was establish an organization and drew a fixed salary and didn't just accept gifts from all kinds of people. Another thing that Billy Graham did quite famously was have the Billy Graham rule, where he and the people that he traveled with were very scrupulous about making sure that there weren't any sexual scandals. And again, this is constantly a problem, not only in church but also in politics, and the entire Me Too movement is raising the awareness now. The Oxfam controversy that I mentioned in my sermon, where villages in Africa and in Haiti after the earthquake, prostitution was developing in exchange for food aid. This kind of stuff is common, and one of the things that Graham did was establish an organization to keep him from temptation and to keep him from scandal. And this was part of the reason that Graham could have the significant influence he could have in not only the United States and the Western world, but the entire world. He was enormously influential. And if you want a good book to read about the history of the neo-evangelicals in that period, read Molly Worthen's The Apostles of Reason. Really an excellent book. I also noticed that the Washington Post took pieces from the same book, and they had a number of articles about Graham on their site, but the number one article that people were interested in was this about his failures as a father. Now it's interesting that in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, all of the focus would have been on, money, sex, and power, and using his institution to limit these areas. And a blind side was there for his attention to his family. And as Peterson notes in his chapter on Rule 5, children need two parents. And Billy Graham's wife, Ruth, was in many ways abandoned to raise the children by herself. And it's been very public for a long time that those children struggled, and those children struggled with a lot of things. And that against the backdrop of the expectations in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and onward, that not only should Billy Graham live an exemplary life in terms of money and sex and power, but his children should be examples, and many of his children were not at all examples, getting lost into and in trouble and drugs and a bunch of other things. I also noted, though, that it's interesting that the Washington Post story, which the Christianity Today story was also quite transparent with respect to that side of it. The Washington Post story, in a sense, is also serving in terms of narratives. In other words, the sins that Billy Graham sought to avoid in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, he was successful in avoiding via his institution, but he was blind to other sins. And this again is the narrative that we are prisoners to sin. If you read Neil Plantinga's book on sin, which is a sensational book, we are blind to ourselves. And so some of what gets into this then for me is getting into some of Peterson's disposition of saying, look, don't discard the tradition too quickly. What the tradition probably brings you is a lot of ancient wisdom, and wisdom that has been tried and true. And this highlights in a sense the groundbreaking nature of Billy Graham's enterprise. He was trying to do a new thing. Now, in the religious fervor following World War II, this, again, church attendance reached its height in all of American history during the Cold War. And I think there are multiple influences in that. But Billy Graham was trying to establish what was then a parachurch organization, and this also was a new thing. And so in a sense, Billy Graham is taking the tools of post-World War II modernity and using them to approach religion, and some of the traditional structures that would have been around him if, for example, he had stayed a local church pastor, probably could have served him better. But this is always the traps that we succumb to as we go through history. We're always trying to grab the new, appropriate the new, try to use it to our advantage, but we're blind to some of the old. And, I thought the Washington Post piece was good, but there is, after now the Cold War, and after the tremendous rise in influence and power of both the mainline churches, neo-orthodoxy, neo-evangelicalism, after the 60s and the 70s, there was kind of a taking of account of its failures. And so now we look back at Billy and Ruth Graham's decisions, and we say, Ruth shouldn't have sacrificed herself so much, and Billy and Ruth shouldn't have allowed the children to be sacrifices to their ministry ambitions. These are the kinds of things that pastors and their families deal with, but not just pastors and their families, anyone who's successful. And again, I think about what Peterson has to say about, why it's so often men that rise so high, workaholic men, and women, in a sense, don't often make those choices because they're looking for not just a tremendous amount of status and success in one area, but they're looking to, be successful in the home and in their marriage and with the children, and if they're working outside the home, in the workplace, and they're looking to try to level that. So that then leaves you with the question of, would Billy Graham have been so successful if he had adequately taken care of his family, if he hadn't always been away for months at a time all over the world leading these huge meetings? Now, again, a lot of you say, well, Jordan Peterson, he's rising so high. He's nothing compared to what Billy Graham was. And Billy Graham, in a sense, used institutions to not only establish and give him influence that endured, but to be able to increase his influence. So there are a few thoughts about Billy Graham. I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. Christian Reformed churches were often quite suspicious of evangelistic crusades. In the 80s and 90s, Christian Reformed churches, as they became more and more influenced by the evangelical world, opened themselves up to it more. But Christian Reformed churches were always pretty traditional and conservative, and always had a bit of suspicion about conversions that seemed to come a little too quick, a little too easily, a little too emotionally laden. And I don't say that to criticize Billy Graham's operation at all. I think probably Billy Graham set a standard high for many of the evangelists who would follow, like Luis Palau and a number of other ones who really learned from his organization and tried to work with local churches and try to do everything right so that those who would desire to become Christians in a crusade would then be able to get connected with a local church. And I know a number of you want me to talk more about the church, and I will, because one of the dominant themes I see coming out of my comment section is this question: do I need the church to be a Christian? And we're going to have to talk quite a bit more about that. So you asked for some comment about Billy Graham. There's some comment about Billy Graham. I hope in some ways my meandering was helpful.